Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm so excited to have with me Professor Maxwell Stearns of the University of Maryland Carey School of Law as our guest today. Max, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Vanessa.
Looks like we had a little temporary internet glitch.
Yeah, I wasn't
Well,
sure if it was my end or yours or
this is the world we live in. This is a
it
Zoom
is
world we
indeed.
we live in. We're always subject to our various internet connections. So I see a bunch more folks are coming on just right now. So I may like redo the introduction. But this first part, I'm actually going to start by talking about how we got to know each other. So a little bit of background as people come on board. Um, as you all saw from the email for registering, this webinar is really for Professor Stearns to talk about his new book, Parliamentary America. And I know that so many folks registered for this and are interested in this topic just because, folks in our community tend to be very thoughtful and nuanced in, how we solve problems within our society and our democracy. And this, you know, Professor Stearns, I'm just going to call him Max because I call him Max in everyday life. It's hard for me to get used to that because as a former law student, when you meet somebody who's a professor, you call him professor kind of forever. But we met about, gosh, 5 years ago now. He came across one of the early versions of the media bias chart. As prolific writer and blogger, prolific um, academic academic published author in law journals. And I mean, when I say prolific, really just churns out a remarkable amount of academic content, really high quality. So I was honored that he wanted to write about the uh, insights about the media bias chart and the role that it plays in polarization. And over the last 4 years, he's been working on this book. I'm really excited that it's come to fruition because given his experience as a constitutional law scholar, he really deeply understands like the structures of our constitutional democracy and the role that the media plays in that. And this book is all about proposed solutions. I'm a big fan of solutions for fixing these things. So we're both very solution oriented, and I wanted to start sort of at sort of in the middle of the book, which is called Parliamentary America. I'm going to be pitching this to you all night. I'm going to put links in the chat for it at the end. We will take Q&A. Chat is not open, but Q&A is open. So please drop them in as you go along, and I will select them at the end to get answered. But I want to start in the middle. Max, could you talk about the media's role in polarization, and then shift to the other causes of polarization that you address in your book?
Absolutely. And let me just say, it's just been such a pleasure to work with you in your project. And it's been an honor to be on the board of advisors for Adfontes and just to get to know you and the important work that you're doing. So I'll go back to how Vanessa and I met because it's going to be helpful in answering the question. I stumbled across an early version of the media bias chart and I sent her an email. I think the email began something along the lines of, I'm late to the party, because others had discovered this. Apparently, more than 1 million others had discovered this. But I came late to the party and I saw this. And to me, that very simple graphic, the media bias chart, which roughly conformed to the shape of a standard distribution, although it's not a distribution in the plot density sense, captured some fundamental aspects of relationships about the media. And I wanted to see whether, I'm going to call you Vanessa, whether Vanessa shared some of my intuitions about this because I wanted to post about it on my blog. It actually ended up becoming the first of several posts on my blog about the media bias chart. Um, and if you look at the shape of that distribution, and I know you all have this sort of etched in your brain as members of this wonderful community, what you have on the east-west axis is ideological bias, left or right, and what you have on the north-south axis, of course, is what Vanessa refers to as reliability. And we see that it looks like a standard distribution, more or less. And the question is, why are there these publications up in the middle, and why are some of them way down in the wings, and why the descent? And what does that tell us about the nature of polarization in the information age, which ends up relating not only to Vanessa's project, but to mine. And that's where these two things come together. And so when you look at that chart, what you realize is that the traditional print media sources, the ones that kind of top center historically, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, they had these really heavy investments in production and sending reporters around the world, and print technologies, a literal wall between news and opinion. And so you could think of those as really heavily bonded commitments. And even when they went into the modern sort of media age posting, they still retained all of that. And what that means is that those sorts of sources are very unlikely to chase some salacious story just to get a quick hit, when the consequence of doing so is going to compromise the integrity that they've spent years building up. And believe me, I don't mean to suggest that these news sources that I've listed never get things wrong or never make mistakes. Everything is relative to other sources. On the other hand, if you're an upstart sort of social media news outlet and you don't have a lot of resources, well, what can you do? Well, you can get a lot of attention by simply publicizing stuff that affirms one side, even if it's really not very reliable and it's got a very strong ideological content. You'll get a base of people that follow it. And along the sides of that distribution are more credible sources that don't have the sources to generate original content, but they've got really thoughtful people to analyze that content. And they're not going to want to fritter away their reputation either. And when you put all that together, you end up with this shape. And what that media bias chart reveals is what you can think of as a series of equilibrium points, places where these media firms place themselves based on their available resources, based on the presence of or absence of a meaningful bonded commitment to high reliability. Well, when we look at the media bias chart and we take into account that most people today are not getting their media by subscribing to large numbers of credible news sources, they're getting it through venues like Facebook, Meta, or they're getting it through Twitter, X, or some other social media outlet. We have to ask ourselves, well, how does that change the dynamic? And when you think about the business model of these social media sources, which Vanessa and I refer to as news media conduits, they're not the generators of information, but they're the conduits through which we as subscribers are in our feeds given information. It turns out that the business model of Twitter and Facebook and TikTok and so forth is really designed to keep the users actively engaged, because that's what advertisers want. As the old saying goes, if you're not paying, you are the product, not the consumer. And we're all the product. They want to advertise to us. And the way to get us actively engaged isn't to give us those up the middle, balanced, thoughtful stories. It's to give us stories that affirm the righteousness of the position that we embrace, or denigrating the other team, right? With content that's, their perspective that we and our friends can kind of make fun of and criticize. And so it turns out that when you combine that brilliant media bias chart that captures so much information in a single visual, with the change in the way news is conveyed, news and news-like information, we can understand a really significant contributor to polarization. The business model of the social media sources, the news media conduits, rewards conveying content that's highly ideological and low reliability. And that's had a transformative effect in pulling apart our parties. So anyway, that's sort of the
It,
media side of it, and there's more obviously to say, but
yeah,
that's the connection on the media side.
I love what you say about it, how the news outlets choose their readers now, not the other way to not the other way around. And that's goes back to the other main driving factor behind polarization. You talk a lot about gerrymandering, and I'd love for you to elaborate more on that about you know news outlets choosing their readers and politicians choosing their voters.
Yeah, absolutely. So gerrymandering isn't new. Actually, the word gerrymander comes from an old governor in the founding period named Eldridge Gerry with a hard G, who drew up a map in Massachusetts that took the shape of a salamander. And he did this because what he wanted to do was get more favorable districts for his party and fewer favorable districts for the other party by packing them in heavily, concentrating them into supermajority districts so they would get fewer seats and his party would get more. And when they and somebody put together this portmanteau, gerrymander, which became gerrymander, and everybody around the world knows this term. But what's changed is the technical capacity to engage in gerrymandering with stunning scientific accuracy. So David Daley, former editor of Salon, produced a book with the unceremonious title Rat Effed, and it's basically the story of Republican operatives in the aftermath of Obama's first presidential victory, realizing that for pennies on the dollar, they could throw lots of money to state electoral races and turn enough purple and blue states red. And because the states typically draw the maps for House congressional districts, they thought they were going to have a lock on the House for a period of about 20 years. Now, they didn't quite get that much, but they got a lot. In this scheme, which is referred to as red mapping, and just to be clear, Democrats do this as well, but not necessarily as well, but they do it also. And you'd call that blue mapping. The consequences of red mapping and blue mapping mean that general elections for the House are not competitive because the districts have been drawn in a way that's protective of the incumbents and that spreads the wealth for the controlling state party. So in the general election, our representatives are choosing us rather than us choosing them, just like through social media, the media sources are choosing us rather than us making independent decisions about, gee, which handful of news sources do I want to subscribe to? I do want to clarify one thing. Although the general elections for the House aren't competitive, the primary caucus cycle is competitive. And when you think about that, the primaries are a threat to incumbents. If they don't give enough to their base, they can be primaried by somebody who will go further to the base. And when you put these things together, the social choice conveyance of news and news-like information pulling us apart, the fact that our electoral politics for the House rewards candidates who move further apart, we see a cycle from news media sources to politicians to voters, all being pulled further and further apart, giving rise to the crisis of our democracy, characterized by this growing intense polarization in the information age.
Yeah, and to be clear, you say over and over in your book that and you've said in talks that I've heard you give that polarization is the enemy of democracy. We're not talking about like one particular party. I think when the terms like threat to democracy, they get thrown around a lot. But in your view, the polarization itself is the deepest threat. Can you talk? Please, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'd love for you to get into how we got here from the constitutional structures of this intense polarization.
So the interesting way to think about it is we sort of have to revisit our childhood a little bit. We have to revisit lessons that those of us who grew up in the United States sort of learned in middle school civics, high school history. We learned lessons about what the framers set up by way of our constitutional system. And in the book, I refer to it as a rock, paper, scissors Constitution, although I add a layer that I call scissors, paper, rock. But the basic idea is we were told that the framers set up this system whereby for each branch of government, that branch could defeat another branch and also be defeated by another branch. And this is true for every combination of the branches. And so what the framers thought that they had done was set up a rock, paper, scissors constitution where each branch, members of each branch, would be jealous of their institution and would resist encroachments by the other branches of government because of the jealous safeguarding of the powers and prerogatives of their branch. And then on top of that, we would add this layer that we call federalism. So we'd have rival jealousies across the three branches of government: Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary, with an emphasis on the Supreme Court. And we would have rival jealousies between the federal government and the states. And what the framers thought was that this would break and control what they called the violence of faction, by which they really meant permanently entrenched interests, sort of precursors to parties that would permanently embed themselves. But in fact, what the framers did was they created a set of systems that inevitably gave rise ultimately to a two-party system with a very different set of games and a very different set of jealousies. It became foreordained that our House elections were going to be single-member districts by about the 1840s. The Senate's representing states, and as a result, you could think of the state as a single district. The presidency represents the country as a whole. You could think of that as a kind of a macro district. We do have this peculiar electoral college, and we can talk about that. But when you think about that game, when you have a single person representing a particular geographical place, voters quickly realize that the winning strategy is to keep your side intact and fracture the opposition. And the other side realizes the same thing: keep our side intact, fracture the opposition. The consequence of those dynamics are ultimately forming two dominating parties. That has characterized our politics literally from the beginning. And in fact, you can go back to George Washington's farewell address to see that he lamented the growing factional violence between two ultimate parties. And although the parties have changed throughout our history, we've always had a two-party system. Now, just to be clear about that, a two-party system doesn't mean we don't have third, fourth, and fifth parties. When you go to vote, you see a list of parties and candidates representing those parties. What a two-party system means is that third, fourth, fifth parties play a confounding role in our politics. When you vote for a third party, you get punished rather than rewarded for doing so.
I want to spend some more time on that because I know that that's a topic of great interest to the folks on this call. But I wanted to throw in one question, and
Sure.
then I wanted to ask you about uh, um, our democracy compared to other democracies, and to preview the solutions that you're advocating in your book. So first thing, we had a question about like, why is polarization the greatest threat to democracy? And I have like strong thoughts about this too, because I typically get the question, you know, I don't think it's polarization. I think it's that the other side is wrong. And the other side is the threat to democracy. And what in the work that we do at Fontes, what I specifically refer to in terms of polarization is affective polarization, the type of polarization that's so strong that you don't just merely disagree with the other side. It's that you think the other side disagrees with you because they're stupid or evil or both.
Well, that's,
And
yeah, exactly
yeah,
right. Exactly
and
right. Yeah.
and there's this and when folks folks that say, well, it's not polarization that's the problem, it's the other side that's the problem. Affective polarization has this insidious effect where you cannot differentiate between members of the other side. Like you can't differentiate gradients. So everyone is either like woke Antifa or like uh or like Nazi fascists. And so like if you can there's no accommodation to acknowledge somebody is like maybe center left or center right and may align with one of the parties versus another without associating them with the worst fringes of that particular side. And because we've got such an entrenched two-party system, it's really easy for people to say like, well, you voted for the guy on the left, you voted for the guy on the right. You agree with the most extreme versions of this of their policies, and uh, that's what I think is why polarization is so damaging. What
I
are your
agree
thoughts?
with 100% of that. I think that's a brilliant and accurate analysis. And really, as what I often say is, we used to live in a society in which we imagined that people could read the same source materials that we've read and in good faith come out drawing different implications or different inferences from what they've read. But today, as you precisely put it, we think that folks on the other team, regardless of which team you're on, either lack basic intelligence or they're somehow evil in their motivations. They have some set of illicit motivations. And it's interesting to go back. I mean, if you go back to the 1950s, there are a few interesting things about the 1950s. One is that in the 1952 election, both the Democratic and Republican parties went after the same candidate to top their ticket, Dwight D. Eisenhower. The American Political Science Association wrote a critique of the two-party system, and the principal critique was that they were insufficiently distinct. They didn't give meaningful choice to voters. And then 5 years later, an economist named Anthony Downs writes a book called An Economic Theory of Democracy, which popularizes a set of intuitions that we all seem to have about our politics, even though it doesn't really describe our politics for the reasons you've explained, which is that, we've got a single line left to right, and we imagine the candidates starting at the extremes and converging on the center, what a political scientist would call the median voter. And of course, that's an egregiously simplistic understanding of the landscape of our politics. But for the reasons we talked about before, the way we get news and news-like information, the way districts are drawn and gerrymandered, we have this pull with these two parties that once overlapped considerably, even into the early 90s. You can look at the Pew Research data on this, and what you'll see is from the beginning of the 90s until the late teens, the centers or modes of these two parties are growing increasingly far apart. Now, part of that is sorting, right? Southern Democrats become Republicans, Rockefeller Republicans become Democrats, at least considerable numbers of them do. But that doesn't explain the growing divergence between the parties. That's a function of these developments in the information age associated with how we actually learn information through the dissemination of news and news-like information through social media, but also the fact that the way our election system is being structured, there is an incentive on each side to move closer and closer to the base. And so you're right. It is, in fact, polarization. And one of the things to think about is one thing that gives rise to polarization is a two-party system, two-party presidentialism like we have. But
Mm-hmm.
another way that you can have a threat of extreme polarization is if you actually have hyper-fragmented parties, too many parties, because then this kind of high valence leader and ideologue can get more seats in the legislature, even without getting anywhere near a majority, and begin to roll over the system and take control. And so what you have to do is recognize that the enemy of democracy is polarization in the ideological sense, but it's also extremism in the number of parties. Too few parties is a threat to democracy. Too many parties is a threat to democracy. We have to
Well, what's the magic? What's the Goldilocks? Based on your study that you cover in the book about democracies around the world, what's a good number of parties?
Yeah, so most political scientists would say it's roughly between 4 and 8. And there's a way to do it, and it actually fits us very well. It would be very adaptable to our system. A system that I propose in the book is an adaptation of a system in Germany called mixed member proportionality. And it has a really interesting set of features. So when you go in and you vote every 2 years in the House of Representatives, you'll cast two ballots, not one. So you'll vote in a district just like you do now. And for the reasons I previously explained, that's going to be dominated by two parties, right? Keep your side intact, fracture the opposition. In those races, it'll be dominated by two parties. But your second ballot is going to be for a party. And then we're going to use the party votes from the second ballot to achieve proportionality by party for each state. So we double the House of Representatives from 435 to 870. Each state sends a proportional delegation. Although it's probably the case that two parties will get more seats than other parties, they won't get a majority anymore because of proportionality, and they're going to have to form majority coalitions to effectively govern. And that system is designed in a way that precisely gets us to the sweet spot, eschewing those extremes of too few parties like the US and the UK. Think of Brexit as a danger of too few parties, or too many parties like Brazil or Italy or Israel. So we want to hit that sweet spot. And one of the ways I convey this in the book is I take the readers on a world tour to several democracies to see what works better and what doesn't work as well.
And that part is really compelling. I want to dive into the amendments a little bit more, but I want to revisit the third party dilemma that you referred to, because we already have some questions popping up about like various electoral reforms. A fundamental thing that I've seen this happen in every election that I've known you on social media. Folks ask the question about like, well, they um, this is like a forever conversation, it feels like, in my lifetime as a voting adult. Like, what about these, neither of these candidates align with what I believe. I want to vote for this third party, and then people have really spirited arguments about why that's a bad idea in our current system, and encapsulate that for us. Like, why hasn't it worked? Why hasn't a third party viable candidate worked in the last all the elections?
Yeah, the reason it doesn't work is because you need institutions that actually allow third parties to emerge and thrive, and actually allow those parties to reward the voters who support them. You can't simply will a third party into being in a two-party system. You have to recognize that there are fundamental structural choices that we made early in our history that conduce to a two-party system, and the two-party system is failing. And what we have to recognize, and this is the other reason for the
Wait,
world tour,
why do you say it's failing? Can you talk about why a two-party
well,
system is failing?
what I mean is what we talked about before, the notion that although the parties once considerably overlapped, they are growing further and further apart to the point that it renders our government dysfunctional. We can't get fundamentally important things done. We have these embarrassments of a failure of administration. If you look at the fact that, you know, the basic system of checks and balances that the framers set up, they don't work because the jealousies aren't by institution, the jealousies are by party. So what we see are these rival games between the two major parties within Congress, within each House of Congress,
Mm-hmm.
and actually backing up the president against attacks by another party in Congress. It's not jealousy by institution. And when the parties are moving further and further apart, neither party can give up any part of its constituency for fear of throwing support the other way. We end up with the kind of extreme dysfunctions that we have experienced, at least as long as I've known you, but actually
Yeah,
longer, again and again. And we can pick up specific examples, but
yeah.
I think that your audience is pretty familiar with some of the fundamental failings of governance that we've experienced over the last several years and even decades.
So yeah, you're saying that in like in each branch, the judicial, like the legislative branch, it's not, legislative versus judicial versus executive. It's like within legislative, it's left and right, Republican and Democrat. Within the executive, presidential powers, it's like Republican or Democrat, and like when one comes in, the other one comes out. Like it's a total reversal. And then even within judicial, especially Supreme Court, which is like the one that folks like thought was least likely to get partisan. Now we're just referring to like Republican justices and Democratic justices. like
Yeah,
the
they hate it when we
factionalism
they
takes
hate it
place
when we
within.
do that, but it's just so honest, right? We can just call them
Mm-hmm.
liberal and conservative if it makes them happier not to be called, not to
But
be party
still,
affiliated, but everybody
yeah.
knows, and
Mm-hmm.
part of the problem here is that when you've got this really extreme moves between the parties, aspects, sort of long-standing aspects of democratic norms get ditched, right? I mean, there's a terrific book by two political scientists, Ziblatt and Levitsky, called "How Democracies Die." And one of the major points that they make is that if you look across the history of failed democracies, a lot of people think it's some spectacular military event like a coup, but most democracies die through the gradual erosion of long-standing democratic norms, and we are experiencing that again and again and again. And that's the real threat to democracy. And what we need to do is
Mm-hmm.
just voting for a third party, just running as a third party candidate, that's not going to fix the problem. And it's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
about particular candidates. We could talk about particular candidates, but it's the structures that invite a problematic candidate to come in and take over a party. And if we actually
Mm-hmm.
had genuine party competition with multiple parties that formed coalitions that controlled who's the head of the government, we
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't have a situation in which of only two parties, you can't give up any of your constituency because then you throw power to the other side.
Yeah, so you when the sides are so far apart, you find folks on the left and the right that they don't feel they have a choice if they don't fully align. The choices for president are Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And if you're on either side and you feel that either like there are you have fundamental differences with the candidate that's more on your side, there's not much you can do about it. Like you don't have other choices. So we're getting a lot of questions about ranked choice voting. And I'm sure this comes up quite a bit because, there are not a lot of proposals out there for like, how do we actually fix this? But there are a handful that people are familiar with. I think one of the ones that people are most familiar with is ranked choice voting. Another one is a national vote compact, or like getting rid of the electoral college. There are a few others there, and then I want to spend time talking about the proposals that you advocate for, specifically like constitutional amendments in your book. But talk to folks about given your familiarity with all the possible remedies that folks have proposed, give your thoughts on ranked choice voting.
Yeah, so ranked choice voting gets a lot of press. And I know there are a lot of people in good faith who are deeply committed to the project of ranked choice voting. The fact is that ranked choice voting does not do what people who support it believe it to do, because it operates on a premise that is no longer descriptive of our politics. That premise is that our electorate roughly resembles a standard distribution, which is roughly the shape of the media bias chart, except here we are talking about a population density. And the intuition of ranked choice voting is that you can, if you're a liberal Democrat, a progressive Democrat, you can first vote for the most extreme liberal candidate, and then rank second a slightly less extreme liberal candidate, and then work toward the center in that distribution. If you're an extreme conservative, you can vote for the most conservative candidate, then a slightly less conservative candidate, move toward the center. And so the intuition underlying ranked choice voting is that it will allow us to get centrist candidates. But in fact, it is also known as instant runoff voting. And the best way to illustrate the problem is to go to an actual election, the special election that resulted in Mary Peltola succeeding and getting her seat in an Alaska congressional race. And so in that particular race, it was a top four election. The top four vote getters go to the second round, and she was one of the top four. One of the three, Alan Gross, dropped out. The three that succeeded in getting to the next round were Mary Peltola, who was a liberal Democrat, a gentleman named Pete Bejgich, Nick Bejgich, who was kind of a centrist conservative, and a name that everybody knows, of course, Sarah Palin, who is very much a conservative. And because the way ranked choice voting works is the candidate that gets the fewest votes gets knocked out, and then we reallocate the votes of the people who voted for that candidate among the candidates who remain. The candidate with the least support gets knocked out. Keep repeating it until you have a majority winner. In this particular case, the centrist candidate, we can get geeky about it or nerdy about it, and we can call it a Condorcet winner. Sort of the dominant second choice, there wasn't a majority winner, was Bejgich. However, Bejgich got fewer votes than either Peltola or Palin. It turns out that if a certain number of Palin voters had simply stayed home and not voted that day, Palin would not have knocked out Bejgich. And then Bejgich versus Peltola, Bejgich, the centrist candidate, would have defeated Peltola. Now, I'm not saying this in any way to criticize Peltola. I'm not criticizing the outcome of the election. But if the point of ranked choice voting is to displace extreme candidates with centrist candidates, that requires a standard voter distribution. The problem in our politics is that we have a bimodal voter distribution. That's the specific problem we're seeking to solve. And all ranked choice voting actually accomplishes speeding up getting us candidates that don't represent the center. But also, it's worth noting this. Let's say it did get you to the center. Then it translates into a kind of unemployment act for members of Congress. You're asking Congress to support a proposal, the purpose of which is to replace them with more centrist representatives. And that too is a problem, because when we think about institutional reform, we have to keep in mind who it is that actually is going to be required to bring those reforms about.
Yeah, there were some questions in the chat about this, like, constitutional amendments. As one of the questions was like, constitutional amendments haven't happened in many of our lifetimes. Um, you know, it seems like a Herculean effort to get the current members of Congress in the Senate, like everyone who would be required to pass a constitutional amendment, to agree to do so. And that's a fundamental problem with some other proposals for electoral reform as well. I think we had somebody had a question about open primaries. Do you view those in a similar way?
So open primaries give rise to a somewhat different dynamic, but I do want to come. So there's two questions on the floor, and I want to make sure I answer them both. One is about amending versus non-amending reform proposals, and that's really important to address. The other one is about open primaries. So let me take them in that order, if that's okay.
Yeah.
So a lot of reformers believe the thing to be avoided is amending, because it is really hard to get an amendment enacted. You either have to call a convention, 2/3 of the states have to call a convention, or 2/3 of each chamber of Congress have to propose an amendment, and then the amendments have to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. It's an exceptionally difficult thing to do. There's no question about it. However, many of the non-amendment reform proposals, ranked choice voting, multi-member at-large districts, the compact for states, would actually have the effect of undermining the status. We'll set aside the one about the presidency, but these others, term limits also, although that one would require an amendment, have the effect of being basically threats to the existing status of office holders in the House and Senate. I think the mistake is to imagine that what's to be avoided is amending. What's to be avoided is proposals for which you cannot get those empowered to block reform on board. And one thing we can say, whether it's an amendment or a statute or something else, you are not going to get people on board to vote for a proposal, the purpose and effect of which is to remove them from their offices. Now,
Yeah.
We've actually come fairly close to having a convention twice. In the 60s and 80s, we were within one state or two states. Let's say we have a convention, and let's say they start throwing out proposals that threaten the status of sitting members of Congress, which they very well might. My proposals, unlike every other proposal out there, ensures that every sitting member of the House and Senate retains an incumbent in their existing district or state. It is the only proposal that actually will end the constitutional crisis while allowing every member of Congress to keep their jobs. And so, therefore, it allows a mechanism whereby members of Congress can become the heroes of democracy. We may not like them, but let them be the heroes of democracy. Let them keep their jobs and actually solve the problem, which I
So
believe they can.
that's fascinating. I never thought about that. The point you made about ranked choice voting. The reason that it doesn't result, it's likely not to result in a centrist candidate, is because you need a standard distribution, right? And so, in case people miss that, like standard distribution, Gaussian, looks like the chart, um, we have a bimodal distribution where it's like two, like we have, because we're already polarized already. So you got like on the left and on the right, that's where our voters are. There's like not really the most in the middle. um, that For that reason, ranked choice voting isn't the solution that a lot of folks in the middle
Yeah.
think it would be.
I will say this. I will say that for local government voting and for certain contexts, ranked choice voting can work. There are contexts in which you're more likely to have a Gaussian distribution.
Like
But
in
national,
local
yeah,
elections,
more
say.
locally, right? But
Mm-hmm.
nationally, no. Nationally,
Yeah.
this is the problem.
Because we're
The
already
problem,
polarized.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You have less polarization the more local
Mm-hmm.
you are,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's not to say that there are also examples of bimodal distributions locally, but you're more likely to have
Mm-hmm.
something that looks like a Gaussian distribution at the more local you are, right? So it's
Yeah.
not a solution at the national level.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, let's talk about the amendments.
yeah.
So you propose in your book three specific amendments. And I think it's worth walking through the like, amendment one again, because I think that one's the most complicated one. And then the other two. And as you've alluded to, um, part of the purpose in why you think of it in this manner is because you've got to get the people, they're the people currently in power to actually vote for a thing if a change is going to happen. There were a number of questions in the chat of like optimism of chances of such a proposal coming to fruition. So walk us through the amendments that you talked about in your book.
So there are three of them. And the First Amendment doubles the size of the House. Every state basically doubles the size of its existing congressional delegation. And every voter will go in every 2 years and cast two ballots, one in a district just like you do now. And those folks will get seated. And because of the dynamic of keep your side together, fracture the opposition, two parties will dominate in the sense that they'll get more seats likely than other parties, but they'll get an insufficient number of seats to control on their own, to get a majority as a result of what happens with the second ballot. So in your second ballot, you're going to vote by party. Now, think about this. We have the Democratic and Republican parties, but probably lurking beneath the surface, we've got about 5 to 6 parties, naturally speaking. The Democratic Party fractures roughly between progressives and traditional centrist Democrats. The Republicans fracture between what we could think of as sort of the MAGA or a MAGA wing of that party or the more traditional GOP. There's probably a Green Party. There might be a Libertarian Party. Somewhere between 5 and 6 parties lurking beneath the surface of existing party structure. Let's take a simple example to illustrate how this is going to work. Washington State has 10 members of the House of Representatives. The math is just simple, so let's just go with it. And let's imagine that in the district part of the elections, so we go from 10 to 20 seats, 5 go Democrat, 5 go Republican. And then we have the second ballots, the party ballots. And let's assume that there are 4 parties that gain seats in Washington. We'll call them the progressives, the Democrats, the Republicans, and we'll call them MAGA or America First or whatever you want to call it. And imagine they each get 25%. So now what we're going to do is use the proportional vote for the entirety of Washington State's delegation. The Democrats and Republicans, because of their district victories, have already gotten their 25%. 5 seats out of 20 is 25%. The other two parties, the progressives and the MAGA wing, have gotten nothing. They have to each pick up 5 seats, then they get their 25%. And so you now send a delegation to Washington to Washington, D.C., from Washington State that is 25% each across those four parties. It's not a perfect proportionality because different states have different sizes and fractions are complicated, but the goal is to create sufficient proportionality to break the two-party duopoly. And this achieves that. And it lets every member of the House keep her or his seat, getting all the benefits of past gerrymandering. But the proportionality principle eviscerates future incentives for gerrymandering because you don't gain anything. The proportional outcome will take away the gains that you get through these strategic drawing of further lines. So the First Amendment accomplishes that. It creates a genuine multi-party House of Representatives.
Which is,
Yeah, go ahead.
I want to touch on that point. I've noticed like every time a presidential election comes around and folks want to vote for a third party candidate, the third party candidate almost never has any actual seats in the House of Representatives, or that party, like the Green Party or the Libertarian Party, has zero or like very few seats in actual legislatures around the country. Even in state legislatures, the number of actual alternate party candidates is very few. So functionally, there really is no party behind a presidential candidate that's a third party. And
That's precisely right.
this would change that. Like,
This would
over
change
time.
that in combination with the Second Amendment, because you have to make choices on two axes here. One, how you elect the lower legislative chamber, and then second, how you select and hold accountable the head of government. And it's the relationship between those two things that actually creates an environment in which third parties can truly thrive in a democracy. You can't just will them into being. You have to grapple with fundamental choices that are embedded in our system, recognize what the pathology is, and then fix it. So here's the payoff. So let's say, well, first of all, what's the Second Amendment? In descending order of seats, up to 5 parties will negotiate until they form a majority coalition. And once they do, their pre-designated slate for president and vice president assumes those offices on a fixed calendar. There's a backstop to make sure we absolutely have a government every 4 years on a fixed calendar. We can get into those details if people are interested. We are not going to fall prey to some of the problems people see in parliamentary systems where you end up with vote after vote after vote. There's a backstop. We'll definitely be able to keep it on a calendar. But imagine that you are that Washingtonian who is a progressive Democrat. And so you voted for the Democrat, as between the Democrat and Republican, for the district seat, but you voted for the Progressive Party. Now, instead of being punished, you're rewarded, because when the Progressive Party is approached by either the Democratic Party or even the GOP to help form a government, the leaders of that party will say, well, I'll consider joining your government, but here's the price. I'll join your government if you give us these concessions on these particular policy commitments that our constituencies care about, or you give us these positions in the cabinet, or the first Supreme Court seat that gets open goes to one of ours. Now, you're not going to get all of that, right? But effective political leaders will bargain for what matters most to their constituencies. And suddenly, when you vote for that third party, you're rewarded, not punished. And that third party delivers and plays a genuine role in the creation of the government. Suddenly, you actually have a system that doesn't have third parties operating as randomizers or spoilers. They are actually playing a vital role in democratic governance. And you have to make affirmative institutional choices to allow that to occur. And that's what this book is about, is to explain
Where
that.
does
Yep, go ahead.
Sorry, in what countries is this most similar to? Like, where does this something similar actually happen?
So it's actually based on post-World War II Germany, but it's simpler than the German system. So in this mixed member proportionality universe, there are kind of three pressure points. One is guaranteeing the seating of those who actually win their district seats in Germany. They call them constituency seats. One is party proportionality, and the third one is the size of the legislature, because party proportionality, if you insist upon it in a perfect form, as the German Supreme Court has done, creates some funky math with your numbers. And what happened in Germany was, in order to satisfy the math, they took a 598 seat Bundestag, their lower chamber, and inflated it to 736 seats. They've since gone back and changed their system a bit. We can talk about that. My proposal avoids that. My proposal keeps a fixed 870. It guarantees the seating of the district winners. And we don't get perfect party proportionality, but we get what I call good enough party proportionality, by which
Mm-hmm.
I mean good enough to break the two-party duopoly. I should say the subtitle of my book, I'm not sure we've mentioned it, is The
Mm-hmm.
Least Radical Means of Radically Repairing Our Broken Democracy.
Mm-hmm.
We don't achieve perfection here, but we diagnose the problem of the two-party presidentialism, and the book proposes a remedy that fixes that problem so that we can emerge a thriving multi-party democracy that can then tackle other problems. But that's the goal.
So before we get into the other two, the I think everyone on this call can tell the thought that you put into the structures and how and the incentives is uh it's intertwined, and it takes some following to to and some some real critical thinking to arrive at, like, okay, yeah, that is actually something that could work if like each of these things are addressed. Um, that's not how we like to think about complicated problems as a country. Um, I, folks like to think about, like, well, won't this one thing solve it? So I I want to start weaving in some of the questions that we've had. Electoral college reform, like just switching over to the national, like a national vote or proportional representation, instead of having electoral college be winner take all, why not have it? I know this seems like a solution, just like ranked choice voting, one that people want to propose and try because it seems simpler.
Yeah.
Proportional allocation of electoral votes. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so the problem with that is that you're not getting rid of two-party presidentialism. You're still going to have a two-party system, for one thing. Really, the more dominant proposal, rather than states not going winner take all, is to go with the national popular vote. And there's actually a pact that is in progress among states that it seeks to sort of end run the electoral college by, when it gets to the number of 270 electoral votes among the states that are party to the member pact, they will then commit to following the national popular vote and send their delegations consistent with that, rather than the actual voting outcome of the state. So let's just make it simpler. Let's just imagine that the proposal is as simple as can be. Let's just get rid of the electoral college and have the national popular vote. And a lot of people think that's the solution. That's like the simple band-aid that fixes our problems. Well, it would, in theory, fix one problem. And it's not a trivial problem that it fixes. It fixes upside down elections. We've had 5 of them in our history where the popular vote outcome is different from the electoral college outcome. It's happened 5 times. It might have happened 6 times. The 1960 Kennedy-Nixon election, there was some shenanigans there. It was really close. Could possibly have gone the other way, but let's call it the 5. And it would potentially reconcile the popular vote with the outcome, except it overlooks one peculiar benefit of this deeply problematic institution, deeply problematic in its history, its relation to slavery, but also problematic in the sense that it produces these counter majoritarian results sometimes. The Electoral College does one thing that actually is kind of benign, And we can analogize it to criminal trials. There are mistakes that happen in virtually every criminal trial, but not every mistake that happens in a criminal trial warrants reversal. There's a concept of harmless error. The Electoral College produces an electoral harmless error. If you look at the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, there were 4 states in which there were alleged voting improprieties. But nobody cared about any of them except Florida, because whichever candidate got Florida's 25 electoral votes was going to get the 270 in the Electoral College. If you simply replaced the Electoral College with a national popular vote, then the problem that we often see following these elections, of leading up to elections, of efforts that result in lowering turnout in particular demographic areas on the other side that would favor the other party, you're going to have stronger incentives to do that and stronger incentives to challenge outcomes, because now we no longer have electoral harmless error. Now you can pick up votes literally anywhere in the country. All votes are equal. And that might actually push the two parties further apart, making allegations of improper behavior in elections, of people voting who shouldn't be voting, of people suppressing voting who shouldn't be, right? All of these dynamics. It may actually make matters worse, not better. So it's very
So,
appealing, but it wouldn't actually solve the problem. And we're still stuck with two-party presidentialism.
so instead of saying, all right, well, in Georgia, it was this close, in Florida, it was this close, in Michigan, it was this close. Let's look closely at that. And, parties are, incentivized to look closely at that. It's like, well, the national popular vote came down to 50,000 votes all across the country.
And I
Let's
can
look at
look
the ones
anywhere
in
to find them.
California. Look, yeah. Like everyone in every country is like, oh, we found some here, we found some here. Yeah, fascinating. Let I did want to get to one question to further elucidate the example. You gave Washington as an example. So how would that work in like Wyoming? Someone asked, like a smaller state. Just give that
Yeah.
as an
So,
example.
so, so, you know, Wyoming is an interesting state, right? Because it's a single district state. So obviously that's not going to, it's not going to produce the kind of, it'll get 2 seats rather than one, obviously. And it's not inconceivable that you could end up with a party vote that would be different from the actual candidate who represents the state as a whole as a congressional district, in which case you would have some degree of party proportionality, even in a state like Wyoming. Obviously, it works out better in larger states with larger numbers of districts. One thing that could occur, I didn't propose it as a reform in my book because I wanted to keep it streamlined. But one of the things I say in the book is that once we are a multi-party thriving democracy, we can solve some other problems. And this is actually a problem that wouldn't be that difficult to solve. You could imagine a number of states that are very small in a specific region choosing to form a pact together to achieve greater party proportionality by combining their congressional district seats and doubling it. That would be something that if they wanted to, they wouldn't be required to, right? That's not one of my proposed amendments, but it is something that would naturally follow as we move to a thriving multi-party democracy. There are other things we could do at that point that might make state voters more satisfied than they would otherwise be as a result. As I said earlier, the math of our states complicates things, but we don't need perfect party proportionality. We just need good enough proportionality to break the particular crisis of our democracy founded in two-party presidentialism.
We didn't get to we touched on the first two amendments. The second one about reinventing how we elect presidents, like having the House of Representatives do that. Can you touch briefly just on the last one, and then I want to just wrap up with some things, and well, we might go a couple minutes over, but I
Oh,
want to make sure I give a
of
pitch
course.
for your book and show people where they can get it.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, so the Third Amendment is designed to ensure a greater degree of accountability than we have. Imagine if you went back to the to the Constitutional Convention, knocked on the door and said to the framers, hey, I know you're working on this impeachment clause. Do you think if the country lasts for 240 years under the Constitution, there will never be a president who deserves to be both impeached and removed? And they would laugh at you, right? They'd say, well, of course not. Now, we've had 4 impeachments over 3 presidents. We've never had the successful removal of a president. Why? Because our rival games are not between the branches. They are within branches and between the parties. The only arguably successful deployment of the impeachment clause was Nixon resigning to avoid being impeached. But even if we take that into account, we can say we don't have an effective means of holding a president accountable. I propose a system whereby a supermajority of 60% of the House of Representatives could vote no confidence based on maladministration. I don't give a legalistic definition. I give some examples of the kinds of behaviors that might qualify. I ground it in some history, talking about 4 presidencies in recent history, and talk about specific conduct. The 60% is designed to ensure that it's not just about policy disagreements following a midterm election. The 60% ensures that some percentage of the original coalition members are very likely to go along because you've got a deeply problematic presidency, somebody who is incapable or unwilling of fulfilling their constitutional responsibilities in a meaningful way. And I'll
Now,
just add, and the
yeah.
point isn't to deploy it, the point is to make presidents behave more responsibly and more accountably.
Oh, sorry, cut out just for the last second there.
That's okay.
I'll hang around here to ask you 2 more questions if you don't
Sure,
mind.
absolutely.
But I'm sure people will some folks will drop off here at the top of the hour, and I just want to like highly encourage you if you found this discussion interesting and want to get into the details, because there's really so much depth to the book. Like one of the things I really appreciated about this book is that it's highly accessible, even though it's really it's got a lot of depth regarding the incentive structures, constitutional history, and pragmatic approaches to solving things. Like there's it's digestible. You can really understand how things come together the way you've written it. So it's Parliamentary America, least radical. I don't want to mess up
The
your
least
title.
radical means of radically repairing our broken democracy. I can show you what the cover looks like
Yeah.
for your viewers.
On Amazon, on Hopkins Press, on the website itself, on anywhere you buy your books. So highly encourage you to read and review it. And so let me jump back to a couple of questions that I thought were of interest to this audience. So someone asked, aren't there a lot of examples of multi-party parliamentary systems that have had the same kind of problem with polarized politics, such as Weimar Germany? So like prior to post-World War II Germany.
Yeah, that's precisely right. That's actually why that's not the kind of system I'm proposing. In fact, the system I'm proposing was designed precisely to avoid what happened in Weimar Germany, which was pure party proportionality, and where Hitler got more seats than any other candidate, that began rolling over other parties and got, of course, Hindenburg to actually give him authority where he literally seized control of the entire government, which is why I said that the threat to democracy is extremes, whether we're talking about ideological extremes or the extremes of too few parties or too many parties. Hyper-party fragmentation is an enemy and threat to democracy. So the questioner is absolutely right. That's why actually what I propose is a system that's designed to abate that very risk, mixed member proportionality.
Excellent. Folks that are interested, these are 2 quick things. Folks are interested in advocating for such proposals. What can they do? And second, how can folks get in touch with you?
Well, so folks can certainly get in touch with me at my I teach at the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. My last name is Stearns, spelled kind of weird, Stearns. Maxwell, you can find me. Just Google my name, Google the law school. You will find my contact information. I'm easy to find, and happy to correspond with members of this community. If members of this community have audiences that might be interested in these kinds of conversations, reach out to me. I'm happy to do that. This is the beginning of a process. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I want to change the nature of our national conversation. I don't know when I know we're in a constitutional crisis. I can't say for sure when the inflection point is going to hit, at which we will have to make vital decisions to avert the risk to our democracy. The dedication of my book is very simple: to my children and yours. And I think a lot of people are committed to ensuring that future generations get to live in a thriving multi-party democracy. And so I think the first step is to educate the public to understand what the pathology is and what's required to cure it. And it's just the beginning of the process. I'm going to be talking to multiple audiences. I've done it already. And I hope to sort of get more people enthusiastic about this idea and take on these conversations themselves and begin to influence decision makers so that they too can become educated. Because we all need to revisit the things that we were told as children that weren't necessarily true.
That's excellent. I think that's a great place to end. The folks on this that are members of this community are very interested in practical, pragmatic solutions and are open to, to ideas, to things that resonate, things that can bring folks together, things that can actually, instead of us admiring problems and talking about how bad they are, like, taking steps to actually improve stuff. So, one step is, talking, listening, and exposing yourself to ideas. Another step is sharing that with your friends. So thank you so much for doing that with us this evening. It was really a pleasure having you on. This recording will go out to all of you who are on this call if you want to share it with your friends. But yeah, I do highly encourage you to purchase Maxwell Stern's book. Thank you so much for being with me here tonight, Max.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for everybody who joined us, and also thank you for the really important work you're doing with Adfantas.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.